Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third annual webinar on risk-based community resilience planning. My name is Bruce Ellingwood, and I'm the co-director of the center. We're very pleased that you can join us this morning. Today's presentations will focus on our research theme for the third year, which is centered on modeling and documenting community recovery. As those of you who have attended our previous webinars know, the center is managed by Colorado State University and consists of approximately 100 faculty, postdoctoral scholars, and graduate students at a dozen universities around the United States. The research programs of the center are grouped into three very broad thrust areas, and the first is the multidisciplinary computational environment with fully integrated supporting databases known as INCORE, I-N-C-O-R-E. You'll hear more about that today. The second thrust deals with the development of data management tools for community resilience assessment, and the third thrust deals with resilience data architecture validation studies, including testbeds, hindcasts, and longitudinal field studies. These thrusts are distributed across more than 40 research tasks, and you're going to hear quite a bit more about them in the next 2 hours. Understanding community resilience requires an understanding of the functionality states of key physical, social, and economic systems within the community, both prior to, during, and following the occurrence of an extreme natural hazard in the weeks, months, and possibly years over which the recovery may take place. Each year, the center activities and our webinars have focused on different stages of the curve that appears in the previous slide. The center was formed in late February of 2015, and we are now a few months into year 4, so that will give you some idea as to where we are in the overall process. Year 3's activities have focused on the recovery phase. This slide shows the major goals and objectives for this particular effort, and these will form the basis for today's webinar. You can see that the major goals are aimed at implementing previously developed algorithms and databases into INCORE, leading to a working version of this computational platform which we expect to develop further in the next year and a half. Today's webinar will include a brief discussion of Center of Excellent Progress. It will include a discussion of the recovery modeling methods that we are currently exploring and implementing. It will have a presentation of some recent studies of performance of Galveston Bolivar Peninsula due to hurricane events, and a longitudinal study, which we've been engaged in for about the last year and a half, on the aftermath of the impact of Hurricane Matthew on a community, Lumberton, in North Carolina. At the end, I will have a few closing remarks about what we have planned for year 4 and in the way of risk-informed decision-making, which is our major theme for year 4, and we'll conclude the webinar with a period for questions. So during the webinar this morning, please send your questions via email to the site shown on the slide here during or just after the webinar. You may direct your questions to a specific speaker, or we will select the best respondent based on the topic of your coverage. And please feel free to ask whatever questions come to mind during the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor John Vandeland, also from Colorado State, who will give an overview of some of the accomplishments and the progress that we've made so far during the life of the center. John?
Thank you, Bruce. As you just heard from Bruce, the organization is around yearly themes, and so I'll go through this relatively quickly. Year 1 with knowledge consolidation and team structure. Year 2 with focusing on INCORE. Year 3, recovery modeling, INCORE goals and performance metrics. And that'll be primarily today's webinar, at least the last hour and 40 minutes. And specifically, recovery modeling, the stochastic models. You'll hear about stochastic models of community recovery following natural hazards, particularly a focus on interdependencies. We'll talk more about INCOR, and then also the initiation of the process flow. So again, then year 4 is risk-informed decision support, and then our last year will be utilization of INCOR as a decision tool. And so now I'd like to go ahead and do a quick progress review, summary of what we did in year 2 and into year 3. So INCOR itself in the development focuses on a number of things. It has individual hazards, multiple and competing hazards, physical infrastructure, social systems, economic systems, as well as optimization strategies and community resilience. And then 4 test beds. You'll hear about 2 of these, actually 3 of these, in detail later today as examples. So last year, if you joined us for the webinar, we focused on a special issue of Centerville, which is a virtual community, and this is a special issue in sustainable and resilient infrastructure. Centerville was a very simple community with data that was essentially designed to be manageable by the center as the center began its work. So the presentations last year looked at building portfolio analysis. You'll hear more about this. This has progressed into a real test bed now, which we'll talk about shortly. And this involves uncertainty propagation, spatial correlation modeling, and other details, ultimately with the intent of informing risk-based decisions. The water network and electrical power network were connected. Those were already dependent last year, and you'll hear more about that for a real test bed rather than Centerville later today. The flow diagram of a computable general equilibrium model. This has been done now for a very large metropolitan area, and you'll hear about that from Harvey Cutler shortly. Then last year we did an INCOR version 1 demo. The architecture of INCOR is changing now, but this looked at the building portfolio analysis. And so last year it was presenting the science and then showing the actual demo or the product of the center. In INCOR eventually, these are all under development, eventually there'll be content examples that researchers will be able to build onto and to use as their own examples or to emulate. This will involve Centerville, Seaside, Oregon, the Memphis Metropolitan Statistical Area, Galveston, Texas, Joplin, as well as Lumberton, North Carolina. There are 2 tiers of hazard within INCOR. One is that it's executed, the tier 1 is executed completely within INCOR using plugins and libraries, and you saw that in version 1. But there's also a tier 2, which involves actually bringing raster files in with the area of interest, and this is things like overland surge flow from AdCirc or other software. There's also physical infrastructure, buildings. You'll hear quite a bit about this in the portfolio analysis. For seismic, many of these were imported from Mavis Ergo, but as well as tornado wind. There's 4 damage states, 5 functionality states for many of these hazards. Transportation, this includes damage fragilities as well as repair fragilities. And then water and wastewater, and this is to predict physical damage and functionality, as well as the interdependency with other physical systems, as well as social systems, which you'll hear about in a few minutes. And then electrical power networks, natural gas networks, as well as telecommunication networks. Aging and deterioration, essentially chronic hazards, are also included, and these are time-variant fragilities as well as repair rates, and they include concepts so that these, such as shifting fragilities as a function of input. As I mentioned, there's now a spatial dynamic computable general equilibrium model, the SDCGE, that is incorporated into INCOR. And this looks at things like losses in production, wages, jobs in the local economic sector, and with the intent of looking at policy levers rather than simply engineering changes. Social science modeling and analysis, this focuses on population and employee dislocation, housing and restoration and recovery, and essentially consists of a suite of tools. Recovery modeling in INCORE, which I'll remind you is today's webinar, and that involves the recovery of the community building portfolio for MMSA, which is an area of about 1.4 million people, looking at electrical power network, recovery of services, the interaction of those with the interaction of water, social systems and services, housing, education, healthcare, and the population stability itself. And then also, we've looked at optimization and decision modeling, which you'll hear more about today, coupled with other physical systems. And the idea is, of course, to enable open source solvers or commercial solvers within INCORE. The details of that will be in next year's webinar, which you'll hear about toward the end of today by Bruce. And so I want to close by simply reminding you of the test beds. Each has its own purpose. Centerville, USA is a virtual community that you've heard quite a bit about. This provides researchers this simplified illustration of how individual infrastructure portfolios can be modeled and how we can link those with social and economic systems. Seaside, Oregon, a major purpose of this is to look at a multi-hazard, or what we sometimes call a successive hazard, and that's earthquake plus tsunami. The Memphis Metropolitan Statistical Area is to investigate the scaling of these research tools to go from a town of 10,000 or a town of 50,000, a city of 50,000 like Centerville, to a metropolitan area of 1.4 million people, to make sure that the methods and the science is applicable to communities of all sizes. And then Galveston and the Boulevard Peninsula, which you'll also hear about today, the focus on the hurricane scenario, both Tier 1 and Tier 2 research tools, and also looking at data-driven social science modeling that you'll hear shortly presented. And so finally, INCORE validation is key. And so one of our major validation studies is to look at the Joplin, Missouri tornado from 2011 to validate, verify and validate individual algorithms. And then the Lumberton, North Carolina field study. And this is to validate new methods of data collection, as well as the links or the dependencies and interdependencies between engineering and social science. And this you'll hear about in some detail later today. So with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Paulo Gardoni, a professor at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and associate director of the center. Paulo?
Thank you, Professor Vandelin. In this portion of the presentation, I will talk about the integration of physical infrastructure and social systems. I will explain why it is important to model such integration and how this can be done in a mathematically rigorous way. Physical infrastructure provides essential goods and services to communities, supporting the population's well-being. However, natural hazard might damage physical infrastructure, causing a possible loss or reduction in their functionality or capacity. Also, the human response and the possible decision to relocate or dislocate might change the demand for goods and services. Today, I will present a general methodology for modeling the integration of physical infrastructure and social systems. First, for a given region of interest, we need to define the footprint of the hazard and of each network. The footprint of the hazard and of each network might exceed the footprint of the region of interest. The hazard and the different networks might have different footprints. The hazard footprint has to be at least as big as the largest network footprint, and in general has to include the source of the hazard. The definition of each network footprint depends on 4 key factors: the type of information of interest, whether it's physical damage or loss of functionality, the existence of easily recognizable physical boundaries, and the possibility to model the boundary conditions, the existence and location of strategic elements that need to be included, like generation nodes, and the modeling of the damage propagation among physical infrastructure. Once we define the footprint of a network, we need to define its granularity, or in other words, the resolution of the model. In this presentation, I will use a water network to explain some of the key concepts. However, the concepts are general and they are applicable to any other network. We define a tributary area as the area served by a single network node. And then by changing the size of the tributary area, we can define network models with different levels of granularity. In the limit, the most refined model considers each single parcel or house lot as the tributary area. The nodal value of the quantity of interest is then the spatial average over the tributary area. In terms of modeling, different granularities affect the ability to describe the spatial variability of the impact over the region of interest, affect the ability to describe the changes in the network capacities and demands following a disrupting event, and finally affect the ability to describe the recovery process, since skeletonized networks only include main lines and not the smaller distribution lines. Once we define the resolution of the model, we need to estimate the nodal capacities and demands. The water capacity at each node depends on the physical characteristics of the elements of the network, as well as the network topology, all of which are defined by the state variables X. The water demand at each residential node is linked to the population living in the corresponding tributary area. Models of social systems are then used to determine the number of people living in each tributary area. Census data typically provides information about the number of people in residential areas at the zone level, which is typically a higher level than the tributary areas. So we assign people to each tributary area using a random allocation. Based on the total number of people, we calculate the water demand for each tributary area. Here, in terms of uncertainty propagation, uncertainties are introduced in the population allocation to each tributary area. We estimate the commercial and industrial water demand using a similar approach based on the commercial and industrial activities in each tributary area. When a network is damaged, there can be a direct impact on its capacity. Fragility curves can be used to assess the damaged state of the nodal elements. Repair rate curves can be used for the linear elements to estimate the expected number of failures per unit length. Physical infrastructure often depend on each other, and such dependencies might indirectly affect a network capacity. As a result, even if a network has no physical damage, there could be a loss or reduction of functionality of such network because of the physical damage and the corresponding loss of functionality of a supporting network. So we need to translate the physical damage into loss or reduction in functionality and then propagate such loss or reduction across all dependent networks. But not only the capacity, also the demand can be affected by dependencies. For example, building damage can lead to people dislocation or business interruption that affects the post-event water demand. The updated network capacity and demand can then be used in a flow-based network analysis to assess the functionality and reliability of the network. To model the recovery process of each element in a network, we develop a stochastic formulation that accounts for the actual work progress. The formulation models the change in time during the recovery process of the state variables X that define the network elements. By modeling the state variables X during the recovery, we can estimate the network capacity over time, accounting for the relevant uncertainties. The developed physics-based recovery curves are intended to replace the arbitrary recovery curves that have typically been adopted in the past. As the individual components recover, the network functionality also recovers. The interdependencies among physical infrastructure and social systems also shape the recovery process. Lack of potable water for an extended period of time could induce further population dislocation. The additional population dislocation could affect the water network demand in an iterative process that captures the interdependency between physical infrastructure and social systems. To illustrate some of the concepts I presented today, I will use the city of Seaside, Oregon. As part of the work of the NIST-funded Center for Risk-Based Community Resilience Planning, we consider a number of test beds that allow us to test and verify different algorithms through calculations, experience, and intuition. One of the test beds is Seaside, Oregon. This is a relatively small coastal community that could be subject to earthquake scenarios originating from the Cascadia subduction zone. For this example, we propagated an hypothetical earthquake of magnitude 7.0 with epicenter located 25 kilometers southwest of Seaside. We modeled the potable water network with two different levels of granularity. One is a skeletonized model of the network that I'm showing on the left, where we consider only the main water lines of 6-inch diameters or bigger. The other one is a detailed model network where we consider every line going to each individual home. After assessing the physical damage of the water network, we studied the effects on the water demand of people dislocation due to building damage. People dislocation is estimated using a logistic model based on the probability mass function of the residential structural damage and other socioeconomic factors like income and race. The fundamental idea is that individuals with a higher income are more likely to dislocate in case of structural damage. External people dislocation then results in a decrease in the water demand at the nodes of the water network. And the assessed physical damage of the water network and the reduced demand due to people dislocation are used in a water flow analysis to see if the new water demand is met by the damaged network. We then looked at the recovery of the water network, a flow analysis of the network with the state variable x with a reduced water demand due to population dislocation allows us to assess the availability of water at each node over time. We can see that immediately after the earthquake, the damaged network is largely unable to satisfy the minimum pressure requirement. However, after about 84 equivalent hours of repair work, we have a significant improvement. The interdependencies among physical infrastructure and social systems also shape the recovery process. What I'm showing here is the recovery process that considers the initial population dislocation due to building damage only that I showed you in the previous slide. However, if a household does not have water after, for example, 72 hours, this might lead to an additional population dislocation now due to lack of water. Because of the additional population dislocation, the recovering water network is now able to meet the new demand in less time. In this example, we look at the results of the skeletonized network model. To capture the spatial variability at the finer granularity of the loss or reduction of functionality and of the recovery process, we can consider the more detailed network model. It is important to select the proper model granularity since certain population groups might be more impacted than others or recover more slowly, and tributary areas that are too large could underestimate the actual societal impact. This concludes this presentation on the integration of physical infrastructure and social systems. Our next speaker is Dr. Charles Nicholson. Dr. Nicholson is an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma. Charles.
Thank you, Professor Gordoni. We will now discuss recovery modeling of the built environment. In particular, we will consider the transportation network, potable water network, and electric power network, and the building inventory of Shelby County, Tennessee. The individual subsystems have dependency relationships, and therefore the overall recovery modeling must take this into account. For example, the recovery of the water network depends in part on the recovery of the power network for the pump stations. Recovery of both the water and power networks depend in part on a viable transportation system for the logistics associated with repair, such as transporting work crews and heavy machinery. Additionally, certain elements of any recovery modeling are defined by the post-disaster timeline. For the transportation system, we assume that priorities will be different for the time period immediately following a disaster than that of the longer-term recovery horizon. For example, in the emergency period, we consider efficient accessibility to emergency services such as hospitals and fire departments to be the top priority. Whereas in later stages, the goal might be related to minimizing the total recovery time for the network or optimizing the shape of the recovery trajectory with respect to the community's needs. In our transportation recovery optimization model, we adjust the objective accordingly. This recovery optimization model identifies detailed recovery schedules and work crew assignments in order to meet the desired goal. Additionally, the model handles uncertainty and provides information on the expected value and variation associated with the outcomes, for example, the total recovery time. To model the utility recovery, we have developed the interdependent network flow recovery model, which handles 4 common types of dependencies discussed in literature: physical, cyber, geographical, and logical. The model embeds decision support with respect to assigning and scheduling work crews for repair, and it will also support uncertainty modeling. The objective is to minimize the recovery time and cumulative utility outage experienced across the recovery horizon by the diverse population. The model ties both to the transportation system and uses the roadway connectivity as an input, and it also ties directly to the building recovery model that we will see next. The temporal and spatial modeling allows for meaningful visualizations, which may help in decision support and isolate potential difficulties or interesting patterns throughout the recovery timeline. This level of detail regarding utility recovery provides critical information for modeling building recovery. We define building functionality as a building's capability to be used for its intended purpose. This is a function of both the physical damage state of the structure as well as the availability of essential utilities. In our 2-step modeling, we first simulate the building restoration as a discrete state continuous time Markov chain. The 5 discrete building functionality states are listed on the left. Starting at the most severe state at the bottom, we have restricted entry, then restricted use, then reoccupancy, followed by baseline functionality, and then finally full functionality. In the next step, we will then model a portfolio recovery as a random field with respect to both time and space dimensions. This approach allows us to map the theoretical continuous time Markov chain to the realistic engineering process of the building restoration, and furthermore, integrate the engineering process with the community's social economic characteristics that affect the overall portfolio recovery itself. Here, the 5 building functionality states are shown on the y-axis, and the histogram provides a view of the distribution of these states across the building inventory. For each building that is to be recovered, we modeled transitions through time from its original state all the way through until full functional state is achieved. At any point in time, we can evaluate the status of the inventory and see how the portfolio is recovering. That is, we have a time variant state vector that we are evaluating. The key is in developing a systematic way to model the wait time between these transitions. By studying this wait time, we have the ability to integrate community-specific social economic factors, as well as pinpointing process characteristics that may need to be improved. The wait time is composed of several elements. Inspection, and then after inspection, it takes time to coordinate the appropriate financing, for example, through insurance claims, engineering design and contract mobilization, and then after that, permitting. These elements compose the delay portion of the wait time. Note that the social economic characteristics of a community can play a crucial part in determining this delay time. For instance, one part of the population may have excellent insurance coverage, whereas others do not. There may even be language barriers for some who are unable to navigate the process to even begin the restoration. Next, we have the actual structural repairs that must be completed. This forms the repair component of the wait time. And then lastly, we have to also consider the dependency on the utilities. These calculations are evaluated for the entire building portfolio, given the state of the system at any given time. Finally, the combined information of the utility recovery, along with the modeled delay and repair times, again provides a framework for spatial temporal visualizations. Additionally, this model provides a consistent and rigorous treatment of the various uncertainties involved in recovery. We believe that the set of recovery models we have created and implemented and integrated provide a powerful tool to support community resilience, planning, and hazard mitigation decisions. In summary, we have a network flow optimization model for the transportation and utility systems, which embed decision support and uncertainty modeling. The utility recovery model ties back to the transportation system and informs the building recovery. The discrete state continuous time Markov chain model that we developed for modeling building recovery handles both uncertainty and provides a paradigm for decision support and/or optimization. And as a perfect segue into the next presentation, it integrates community social economic characteristics into the portfolio recovery itself. I will now invite Dr. Nathaniel Rosenheim from Texas A&M to discuss more detail on the methods relating to coupling the physical and social system recovery models.
Thank you, Charles. So as Charles mentioned, I will be discussing in more detail how we coupled the social system infrastructure with the physical infrastructure. And this work was conducted by myself, Pei Wei Lin, and Na-Yu Wong of the University of Oklahoma. To focus on the coupling between the systems, we are focusing specifically, in this case, on a model for reoccupancy, and I will discuss that in more detail. We did both a front-end coupling and a back-end coupling. On the front end, we took into consideration the importance of the concept of social vulnerability. We wanted to do this at the household level and connect the household characteristics with community buildings. I will also introduce the concept of joint functionality recovery states, which builds on the work that Charles just presented, and also show some of the outputs that we have created for Shelby County. When we look at reoccupancy, we are specifically focused in this case on a pre-event household returning to their pre-event housing unit. In order to do this, we have coupled the social characteristics, household information at the front end. We've done this at the parcel level for a community, as well as integrating in the social vulnerability characteristics at the parcel level. This is brought into, as Charles had just discussed, a Markov chain process, which allows us to not necessarily predict precisely the outcome of the community, but to use a random process and to use information in order to statistically analyze the recovery process. Each building has a recovery function, which has already been discussed. But what's more important in this case is that as each building is recovering, we're using household level characteristics to influence and change the restoration function process. In the end, we have a reoccupancy function that is both spatial and temporal for a community. At the front end of this, we wanted to bring in the concept of social vulnerability as an important predictor of an influence of how the recovery process will work. Our social vulnerability concept is at the household level and considers factors that we have found to be significant in the recovery process and in a household's capacity to recover, and also is an important predictor in some of the disparities in the recovery process. In order to do this, we have developed a new process for actually linking household characteristics to the community buildings. We are using the 2010 decennial census as well as employment data from the Census Bureau in order to determine the distribution of household characteristics at a very fine resolution, and then to disaggregate that information in order to link it stochastically to the buildings within at the block scale. To do this, we've actually been able to show that we can link household characteristics at a parcel level to residential buildings. And then we're able to identify which households have children in order to link them to a nearby school building, and also to identify which households have workers, employment, and by industry, and link that to nearby industry buildings. With each household linked to a residential structure, a school structure, and a workplace structure, we use the joint functionality recovery, which essentially combines the recovery process that's predicted for the residential structure, as Charles has just presented, as well as the recovery process for schools and for the workplace. We're theorizing at this point a conceptual model that this joint functionality recovery has a significant influence on the reoccupancy. As the joint function states of each of these community structures increases from at the very lowest level, where a house may have either restricted entry or restricted occupancy, a school may not be functional, and the workplace may not be functional. We're showing here that in this case, the household will be very unlikely to reoccupy. But as time progresses in the recovery process, and as the functionality of schools, workplaces, and residential buildings increases, then the household is more likely to reoccupy their structure. To develop this concept, we have come up with it. And I will stress, this is a conceptual model. Other work within the center is working to validate this and to modify the elements of this conceptual model. At this point, our conceptual model shows here that as time to recover a functionality state increases, then the probability of reoccupancy also will decrease. To the point it's in certain households that the longer, if it takes a significant amount of time, then it's unlikely that the house will ever return to the house that they occupied before the event. We're also including in this one important social vulnerability characteristic, which is income. And in this case, we're theorizing that actually as income increases, then the probability of reoccupancy slightly decreases, whereas households that have more income are likely to wait till the joint functionality has returned to a higher state. We're theorizing here that households with more income have more capacity maybe to stay in a hotel or rent another dwelling unit until their pre-event dwelling unit has returned to a high state of functionality. In this case, we're looking specifically at homeowners, though we are looking at the difference between homeowners and renters. This has been found in other research to be a very significant predictor of reoccupancy, where renters are not able to return to a building until it has returned to a high level of functionality. So with this work, I'll present two outputs that we are working on and ways of presenting this information. In this case, we're showing a recovery process where we have the functionality of schools, the functionality of workplace, the functionality of the residential dwelling units, and then at the bottom, which lags all three of those, the household reoccupancy. In this case, we have time on the x-axis and the probability of the percentage of households that are reoccupying their pre-event homes. And we show here that at the beginning of the event, there are, in this case for Shelby County, which was a very large earthquake, the majority of the population does dislocate. Only a small percentage of the population is able to stay in their homes. And even at the end of the recovery process, we still have households that are not able to return to their pre-event housing units. One of the advantages of linking the population information with the building information is that we're able to generate a very fine resolution spatial analysis. And what we are looking at here are different heat maps of the community, in this case Shelby County, which has about 900,000 people in the county area. And we're looking at specifically where we can locate households where schools are not functional, where workplaces are not functional, where homes are not functional, and then at the end here where households are not able to return to their home. And this is done across both space and time. Ideally, this type of output will be something that will be beneficial for decision makers in order to identify locations within a community that might either need to have mitigation efforts focused on, or in the case of not being able to return to homes, shelters or programs to provide housing over a long period of time. So in summary, I would like to show that we've been able to do this at the household level, that we've been able to include social vulnerability into these models that integrate with both the physical infrastructure and the social system. Being able to do this at the parcel level and showing that this scale is something that is possible to be done at a very large community level was a significant outcome of this research. The joint function states present a method that allow us to do a stochastic process, which will lead into this next year's work with uncertainty. And again, stressing that this research is something that is at the conceptual level, and for the most part, we wanted to demonstrate the ability to integrate the social system data with the physical systems data, and to show that this can be done on a community scale, especially for a community as large as the Memphis area. So our next presenter will go into more detail about the economic system, and this is Professor Harvey Cutler from Colorado State University. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. So I'd like to talk today about the differences between spatial and aspatial and non-spatial CG models, because as it turns out, most natural disasters have a disparate impact on a region. So what we're arguing is that you may have to build a spatial model to capture the unique characteristics or the varying characteristics of a natural disaster. So what we've done for Shelby County is we built two models. One is just a one-region Shelby model, and then one is with subregions, and we have 8 regions. And the 8-region model is much more complicated and costly to produce, but we believe that it can better estimate the distributional impacts of a natural disaster. So I'm going to show you how we've done that. So here is Shelby County. And it's conveniently broken up into 8 different Puma regions. Each Puma region has to have at least 100,000 people, and this has to do with the U.S. Census and how they organize data. So the little thin blue lines represent the 8 different Puma regions, and Memphis is actually located in 3201, 3202, and 3203. So the majority of the population is, in fact, in these 3 regions. But as we know, an earthquake can impact these different Puma regions very differently. So what we've done is we've built 2 models. The spatial model has employment centers in each one of these 8 Puma regions. And the employment centers, given the type of data we're organizing, is 3 sectors: goods, trades, and other. And then we also have 3 different household groups, housing groups in each 5 housing groups and 3 housing services, but the household groups are 5 household groups per Puma region, so there's 40 household groups. And again, they're spread out all over the county. And so what's the case is, if someone lives in 3201 as an example, they could reside there, but they may be employed in 3204 or 3205. So what we have is the data. We know where people live and where people work. So we have a nice grid of commuting patterns in this model. And the non-spatial, or aspatial model ignores all these Puma regions and just has 3 commercial sectors for the entire county and just 5 household groups. So instead of having 40 household groups in the spatial model, in an aspatial model, we only have 5 household groups. So we really aggregate things up. So these 2 models actually behave very differently. And so the idea of economic analysis really is dependent upon something called substitution, is that when different Puma regions are impacted, they're impacted in a different way to where prices move differently. So where one Puma region may be impacted severely, another Puma region may not be impacted as much at all. So what we'll find is relative prices will rise in the area that was damaged, and people who live in a damaged area may end up shopping more in the non-damaged area. So what you'll find is, in a spatial model, you're going to have all the substitution going on, which can actually minimize the impact of the disaster. When you have a spatial model, There's limited substitution that can occur because all the commercial sectors are just grouped into one. So the disaster just impacts these three sectors, and there's very little substitution that can go on. So what you find is that the output or the economic losses when we shock the aspatial and spatial models identically, the economic losses are larger in the aspatial model because no substitution can occur. So as an example, employment falls by 37,000 workers in the aspatial model and 35,000 in the spatial model. So what we're arguing is if you used an aspatial model to model a disaster, you're going to overestimate the economic impacts. With a spatial model, you get all this substitution going on, and in fact, the losses are somewhat less. Not a lot, but in terms of recovery processes, it can be important. Here is, we've looked at household income, and this is actually really demonstrates the difference between this aspatial and non-spatial and the spatial models. Is that, let me go back actually. For economic losses in terms of real household income, the aspatial model predicted a $1 billion loss in real household income, where the spatial model predicted only a $681 million loss in household income. And again, this is shocking the economy and not examining any types of recovery processes, no infusion of resources. We're just looking at the prompt effects of the disaster. So focusing on a difference in real household income, what we've done here is we've looked at the distribution of household income losses. Now, in the non-spatial model, all we have is 5 household groups. And we can see that HH1, families that make less than $10,000 a year, lose $10.3 million in household income, or 3%. Now, in the spatial model, what we've done is we've added up all these different housing groups from the 8 Puma regions. So we have 8 HH1s in each of the 8 Puma regions. So we add up the economic losses of HH1, or the lower income households, across the 8 Puma regions. And what's interesting to show is that the economic losses for HH1 are larger when you spatialize all of the household groups, but in HH2 through HH5, the losses are smaller. So what we're saying is these spatial models are really important in understanding what happens in when a natural disaster occurs. What also a spatial model can describe is, in this last table, is that we can estimate the disparate effects of the natural disaster. So we can see that in terms of domestic supply, Region D loses the most amount of economic activity at 19.3%, and Region G is the smallest fall of 11.3%, and that's consistent with how much damage occurred in these different Puma regions. And because of all the modeling we can do, when Nayu ran these shocks, she damaged each individual building in Shelby County. We then aggregated up these buildings into our different sectors, and with the spatial model, you can see a wide variation in the damage and the economic losses. So then what we try to do is figure out what type of natural disaster would permit you to build an aspatial model. And we're still debating that in our econ group. And we haven't come to one mind on that. But, oops, wrong way. I guess I don't have my last page. Okay. I had a conclusion, but I guess it's not here, but that's all right. So, in the conclusion, you can imagine, if it was up there, Sammy Zaron, I don't know if Sammy's here yet. He's teaching a class right now. Sammy argues that Katrina had pretty uniform impacts in the New Orleans area for the following reason. Downtown was up on a bluff, so the flooding was not as bad. But the rest of New Orleans got severely damaged, so it was he maintains a homogeneous level of damages in New Orleans. Now, we haven't looked at the data. That's his hypothesis. So if we have a homogeneous impact of damages across the region, it might be all right to build a aspatial model because there's not much variation. But I argue that the vast majority of natural disasters have very disparate impacts in the region. I think you have to build a spatial model. So, but we're still working on that. We're also trying to determine what type of natural disaster would actually, just artificial one, would produce a totally homogeneous impact across regions and then allow us to build an A-spatial model, but we're not there yet. So thank you, and I'd like to now introduce Dr. Van Zandt, who's going to talk about recovery processes in Galveston, and I think maybe Lumberton.
Thank you, Harvey. In these next two presentations, we're going to introduce Galveston, Texas, and Lumberton, North Carolina as two of our test beds or field studies for investigating and validating our integrated social science and engineering models of housing recovery. I'm reporting on work undertaken by the folks that you see listed up there from very many different universities around the country. Hurricane Ike struck Galveston and still stands as the fourth most costly storm on record behind Hurricanes Harvey, Katrina, and Sandy. It made a direct hit on Galveston, entering the Galveston Bay between Galveston Island and Bolivar Peninsula that you see there on the map. You can see that the dirty side of the hurricane had a very different impact on Bolivar Peninsula with intense scouring and the destruction of almost all structures. On Galveston Island, which is much more urbanized than Bolivar, the damage was primarily flooding with considerable wind damage. After the hurricane, we conducted a baseline study of initial damage and then followed it up with 2 more years of primary data collection on both households and businesses, including assessments of both structures and occupants. We've continued through the present collecting secondary data to understand the full trajectory of recovery for housing, including single-family homes, as well as multifamily and small rental properties. Our housing and household data includes a 3-wave panel of randomly sampled single-family units merged with tax appraisal data and sociodemographic data at the block group level from the decennial census and the American Community Surveys. Further, we have building permit data from the city of Galveston for the 16 months following the disaster. And more recently, we've acquired SBA loans to households and National Flood Insurance Program claims for households and businesses. For businesses, we initially collected damage data for a stratified random sample of over 4,000 businesses based on their industrial classification code, resulting in a small but robust sample of businesses. More recently, our team, Yu Zhao and Maria Watson, have collected primary data for the operating status of businesses that were operational when Hurricane Ike struck. We've also acquired data on SBA loans approved for businesses after Ike, Texas windstorm insurance coverage and claim data, as well as the NFIP claim data that we previously mentioned. As part of our early work with the data, we want to highlight the importance of urban development patterns and residential occupancy when considering the performance of structures after a disaster, which may be particularly important for coastal communities that typically include both primary and secondary residences. Galveston is characterized by an urban core, which is densely developed with extensive infrastructure and is home to the employment base for this tourism-based economy. The West End is much less densely developed, is a vacation area, and is characterized by seasonal rentals and second homes. The nature of the housing stock is quite different, as you can see, with the urban core characterized by lower quality and older housing stock that is only elevated minimally, if at all, while the West End is characterized by higher-end vacation homes that are often highly engineered to be resistant to both wind and surge. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Walter Gillis Peacock from Texas A&M University to discuss the models developed from our data.
Thanks, Shannon. I'm going to give you a kind of a brief overview of a number of different recovery models that we've developed utilizing the data that Shannon was referring to, focusing on housing and on businesses, and then a little bit on delays in terms of recovery. The first kind of series of models that we developed we are termed housing resiliency models because they're trying to capture that loss as well as then the subsequent return, we hope, or the trajectories, if you will, because often they are quite different trajectories. Our dependent variable in most of our work is the appraised value of structures. So in a very real sense, we're looking at the economic recovery of structures that is building back their value. And it's just the structure, not the the land value or anything along those lines. So it's focusing on the structure. Key independent variables we're included in this is damage, time, tenure, owner versus renter occupied. The literature is quite clear on variations in that. Some socio-demographic and economic factors, income, racial and ethnic characteristics, in part because those capture varying levels of resources that households have access to. We're also looking at a variety of different residential structures, single, multifamily, duplexes, as well as more recently different housing markets. So looking at typical residential housing markets versus, again, these vacation housing markets, which can be critical if we're looking at overall resiliencies, especially in coastal areas, as well as in many other areas of the United States in terms of vacation housing. Just to kind of give you a sense of some of the kinds of findings that we see, this is a graph then. Again, we've standardized or actually initialized the beginning date at 1 for everything, indexed everything at 1, and so we're looking at variations off of that with the loss and then subsequent recovery. Here is for the factors are controlled for in here, so I'm just kind of focusing on specific dimensions. Here we see the damage issues, and those houses that were highly damaged were much slower in terms of recovery, and indeed many did not reach restoration rates, whereas you see minimally damaged homes, or relatively minimally damaged homes, did kind of get back and surpass where they were. Here is a graph for renter and homeowner housing. So dark line is for owner occupied, the dash is for rental housing. And we can see that lag that oftentimes happens. Rental housing is much slower in coming back. In Galveston, for example, 50% of households rent in those areas. So we're talking substantial proportions of the housing in that area not coming back online, having major consequences for population loss. And then finally, this is housing in different neighborhoods based on income. The highest level is the dark line with the triangles. The lowest level is dark line with little circles in it. And you can see that housing in higher income areas rebounded much more quickly. Actually, if you look at the index as well, too, they lost relatively less and rebounded much more quickly versus housing in low income areas. So you look at housing in low income areas, you look at rental housing in low income areas, and we're talking about major discrepancies in terms of those recovery kinds of issues. We've now shifted that analysis and really begun to focus much more on restoration. It's a bit cleaner outcome for us to look at, that is meeting or exceeding pre-IC values or pre-impact assessed values. Our damage impacts now are supplied by engineering models, so we're getting damage state data in, and we can incorporate those in. It's readily convertible into fragility analysis or fragility curves that can be incorporated into INCOR much more easily, and perhaps gives us a way of handling different disasters in terms of the resources for recovery, because we see very different resources coming in based not only on hazard but on other characteristics of the community. Basically the same kind of models, only now we're looking at panel logistic models. Our dependent variables are the logged odds of reaching or exceeding that pre-IC value, looking at damage, time, tenure, socioeconomic status, and then rental characteristics, and then residential characteristics as well. Just to kind of give you a sense of that, this two graphs here, one for rental housing and owner-occupied. On our y-axis are the probabilities of meeting or exceeding restoration values. We've got time on the x-axis, and it's a little bit subtle to see, but clearly rental housing, the probabilities, whether we're looking at high or low damage states, or superficial versus destroyed damage states. The rental housing, again, those probabilities are significantly lower in terms of meeting restoration throughout those periods as well, too. So again, to be able to capture some of those discrepancies. Now here's what we are doing with that. So we're taking our primary and secondary data. We've created these resiliency models, and we will be incorporating those into INCOR. We're now shifting to restoration analysis using our logistic models. And then from that, now we're deriving then fragility for predicting restoration based on single-family, multifamily, based on rental, owner-occupied, as well as different damage states. And we can place them into individual neighborhoods, capturing to a degree then that degree the resources that they would have for restoration. So those would be going to be incorporated into NCORE, one of our goals for this next year. We're also looking at businesses and business issues as well too. So we Yu Zhao has, Dr. Yu Zhao has engaged in and looked at our business data and looking at interruption or failure models at a 3-month point. That is, did the business fail or is it still in operation after 3 months? The key factors are damage, of course. Damage increases those probabilities of business failure. On the other hand, franchises, because of resources that can come in from outside the community, are much more likely to be and continue, as well as manufacturing and construction, much more likely to quote unquote benefit from the event that happened or actually be able to look at those issues. We're linking those together with household data as well too. So Nathaniel had talked about reoccupancy, looking at reoccupancy and business failure and that nexus between those. And when we look at the household level, households are much more likely to reoccupy if that business community is up at different, we've looked at different areas around the community and the degree to which businesses are still up and operating. We see the same kind of influence with businesses, i.e. businesses are much more likely to maintain operation if population is there. The effects are more minor in those characteristics as well too. So you see the interplay, but the interplay is not, those dependencies are not quite the same across both of those areas. The final element that I just want to show you about is permitting. We've talked about permitting and getting that as a major consequence, or can have a major consequences for delaying that recovery and restoration process. So we've looked at the permitting process for structures in Galveston, predicting the earliest date for permits being pulled based on loss, tenure, sales, pre-Ike value, neighborhood characteristics, and then we're so happy to actually have some data on resources, SBA as well, looking at that. So here's just an example. So on our y-axis here we have days to first permit, and then with damage there, and you can see that nonlinear effect there. Notice that the inflection point is around 50%, because at 50% we're dealing with substantial loss, bringing things up to a new code, as well as the negotiations between, am I at 50%, just below 50%, over 50, you know, so all those issues as well too. So you can see that consequence in there as well too. And again, rental versus homeowner, those disparities as well. So in owner-occupied housing, we see permits pulled much sooner than in other areas. And then finally, with and without SBA, and forgive me, it's a little bit messy graph here, but what's interesting here is if we look at and compare rental housing, and we look at rental housing that got an SBA loan, it's quite comparable to owner-occupied housing that did not get an SBA loan. So those curves overlap completely, whereas rental housing with no SBA, you see they're at that highest level there, great delay times regardless of the levels of damage, and then owner-occupied with SBA, much more rapid in terms of getting those permitting process and those moving. So we've accomplished a good bit in terms of our modeling the economic kind of recovery with respect to housing and businesses, linking those together with both our engineering and other social science components. This year we're going to be working more closely and trying to inform the economic models with these data. But our major whole is in model specification is, again, those recovery resources. And we hope we can partner with our federal partners there at FEMA so we can actually get these data to help us better understand that process at the housing level to really kind of capture what's going on. And indeed, it's those issues that have led to our field work. And Dr. Maria Diller is going to talk about our work in Lumberton and how we're trying to fill in some of those gaps there, as well as other things.
Thank you, Walt. So today we're going to talk a little bit about an update on our Hurricane Matthew longitudinal study for Lumberton, North Carolina. So this is one of our field studies within the center. And I'm going to first give a little bit of an overview of the event itself before I talk about the study goals and objectives for this return visit. So Hurricane Matthew hit as a Category 1 in October of 2016 and impacted the state of North Carolina in both the coastal and the inland areas quite a bit. Over 15 inches of rain fell in some parts of this state, and flooding was exacerbated by the pre-existing conditions. There had been a lot of rain during the month of September, so grounds were heavily saturated and ripe for flooding. In Robeson County, over 5,000 people were placed in shelters and in temporary housing by FEMA, and all 42 schools serving 24,000 children were closed for 3 weeks in this county. So here you see the location of Robeson County in the state of North Carolina, and within the black boundary is the city of Lumberton, and this is our study site. And below our study area and also the inundation from the flooding, as well as our selected school attendance zone, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So you see Lumberton is quite inland from the coast, but still had significant impacts from the hurricane. Lumberton has a population of about 21,000 people and is highly diverse in terms of its racial and ethnic composition. You see in this pie chart that the population is largely comprised of 3 groups: a Native American population, mostly Lumbee Indians, Black population, and a white population, as well as a fairly good-sized Hispanic population in this city. So while we're continuing the review of Lumberton and the flood impacts, we wanted to show you a simulation of the flooding within Lumberton and give you an idea of some of the additional work that's happening within the center. So while we usually talk mostly about our field work when we do our presentations, there's an important and extensive amount of background work happening related to the hazard modeling itself and some of the other engineering analyses. So this simulation was conducted by Omar Nafal at Colorado State University, and you see the magenta boundary of Lumberton. And the darker colors of blue in this simulation reflect deeper waters in line with the topography of the city. So 2 major streams enter Lumberton, and in the 600,000 element model with an unsteady flow simulation, we have these 2 main streams coming in. One with upstream data is from the USGS, and then the downstream data is just based on gravity flow. So the measured flow rate for these two streams comes in at 7,000 cubic feet per second, because we have one that's measured, one that we're assuming, and then the measured flow rate for this city is 14,000 cubic feet per second. So as you can see, this model accurately predicts where the water has come into the city over the interstate and around the railroad track, just as it happened in 2016. And here you see from some satellite imagery the pictures that represent that overtopping of the interstate and coming in through the railroad. As an ongoing acknowledgement of the importance of sharing some common terms and making sure that we talk about the meanings of these terms, we define here what we mean by a longitudinal study. So this is the methodological approach that we're taking for this particular field study, and it allows the same cases to be observed over time to track changes, both positive and negative. And in the case of this event, and in most hazard events, it's really important, if we want to understand recovery, that we do this return to the same place, studying the same cases over multiple time points in order to be able to record observations that get us a better understanding of the recovery. So our timeline is that the event hits in October 2016. We do our Wave 1 data collection in November of 2016, and we followed up with our Wave 2 data collection in January of 2018, and we expect to return as well. So the goal of this particular study is really to investigate what is it that happens after the initial damage, the dislocation, the physical damage, the socioeconomic impacts that hit up front. What is it that follows from that initial point and allows us to begin to understand what the process of recovery for a community like Lumberton looks like? And within Wave 2 data collection, we had two primary objectives. The first is to document community interdependencies through our data collection, and the second, to document recovery. So both of these objectives are executed with a focus on the role of the residential and the business sectors. However, the education sector remains a very important component of our Lumberton field study. This work is not possible without amazing project teams that are fairly large, as you'll see in these next two slides. So the Wave 1 project team includes a total of 25 team members from multiple universities throughout the center and from NIST, students and faculty, interdisciplinary. It has social scientists and engineers, and it's representing multi-methods. So we're using surveys of households. We're using physical damage assessments of the housing buildings. We're using interviews, qualitative interviews with representatives of school, infrastructure, utility operators, and others who represent the transportation sector, and meetings with city and state officials to understand the broader context. So Wave 2 has a total of 29 team members. Again, the same multi kind of institution composition here, and again, a strong team of social scientists and engineers. And here we did a combination of household and business surveys, and followed up again with qualitative interviews with school representatives and meetings with our city and state government officials and the water utility representatives. So now I'm going to pass it over to Professor Elena Sutley from the University of Kansas to talk a bit about the changes over time in Lumberton.
Thanks, Maria, and hi, everybody. So yes, as you heard, we made 2 trips to Lumberton a little bit over a year apart. So what changed? I want to take a look at some building imagery that we captured through street view style cameras. So first, let's take a look at single-family housing samples. This sample here we recorded as having been gutted in 2016 when we visited it, and you can see the piles of trash in front of this structure, and we recorded this as a damaged state too. So this damaged state is on a category, it ranges from 0 to 4, where 0 would be no damage and 4 would be complete damage. When we returned in 2018, we were actually able to talk to the residents and confirm that this housing unit was occupied and had been fully repaired. So that was wonderful. Unfortunately, not all of our housing samples had happy endings. Here, both of these samples that you can see in the picture both of these units you can see in the picture were our housing samples. Both units had been gutted and recorded as damaged state 2 when we first visited them. When we returned, the left was recorded as abandoned. It appeared to be abandoned, whereas the right was no longer there, and so we marked it as being demolished. This starts to show the variability in recovery trajectories when we control for damage level and housing type. But let's look at another housing type, multifamily housing. We visited these apartment buildings in 2016. They had been gutted and again recorded as damaged state 2. When we returned in 2018, they were unoccupied and still needing repair. That initial gutting work had been done, but minimal progress towards reconstruction had been made. And our last type of housing sample that we'll look at is public housing. So this is one public housing facility that we visited. These had also been gutted and recorded as damaged state 2. When we returned in 2018, they were unoccupied and still needing repair. And this was largely what we observed across that public housing complex. So let's take a look at businesses. here. Now, we did not survey businesses in Wave 1, as you heard earlier. When we visited them in Wave 2, we asked them about the repairs they had to do, the damage that they experienced, and we did an analogous classification of 4 damage levels based on that information. So this building that you see was classified as a damage state 4. We also asked the owner or the manager that we spoke with what their perceived status in recovery was, and so this business owner indicated that they were still in operation but would never recover from the impacts of the flooding. To leave you on a happy note, another business sample recorded as damage state 4 indicated that they had mostly recovered when we talked to them in January of 2018. And so now I'll pass it back to Maria.
Thank you. So now I'm going to talk about the first of our 2 objectives in this field study, documenting community interdependencies. And in order to develop the methodology for the field study, we thought about the knowledge of interdependencies that we already had. So thinking about a community as a whole and all the components, what did we expect to be connected? What did we expect to be dependent? And then we use this as a basis for our sampling approach, our data collection approach, and ultimately we will use this as the way to analyze our data and develop models. So understanding these community interdependencies is clearly not a simple task. Where it becomes very messy very quickly, and we don't expect that all of these interdependencies are going to be essential to the model. But in order to determine what are the most critical ones to investigate, we need to understand that how these things really are connected, to what extent, and how critical is it to the recovery of the community as a whole, and the recovery of each of these components that you see here in this diagram. So we focused on the residential sector, the business sector, and education, but you see these other sectors that are very critical to our study on the side of this diagram as well. So with our sampling, we began with the flood inundation area in Lumberton. And from here, we selected highly impacted schools within this inundation area. We then draw our housing sample from the catchment area for these different school zones. And finally, in Wave 2, we draw a business sample using the combination of the housing sample, the school zones that are highly impacted, and the inundation area. And in both cases, you see our sample points on this map on the right-hand side. You'll notice that for both housing and business, we select some businesses and housing that are outside of the inundation area in order to understand the broader impacts of the hurricane. So while we're looking at physical damage directly from the flooding, we're also taking into account a broader set of impacts on this community. So in order to look at interdependencies through data collection, we're going to talk about how some of these different sectors are linked, and then how we went about developing methodology that would help us assess these linkages. So here we are looking primarily at the residential and business sector and trying to understand how the recovery of households and businesses are linked. So residents need work in order to stay in their community. They need a job and a place of employment, and the businesses need employees. So our question to households is, to what extent did the members of the household miss work due to Hurricane Matthew? And if so, how much? So we're trying to establish the degree of the impact of the event on their ability to get to their employment. And then we wanted to know what industry they were working in. So this would allow us to start to make some linkages across our business survey as well as our housing survey. So again, we want to understand the dependence of household return on the status of the place of employment and the status of key businesses that provide services to that household. So our questions to households ask about closures and changes of the workplace and whether that causes a delay in their returning home following the event. And then we also ask, did the closure of businesses, these supporting services that people are reliant on, did those things cause a delay in their returning to their home? So again, giving us this connection between the residential sector and the business sector. So these pieces are going to help us understand what is it that delays the households in returning following their dislocation and gets them closer to this recovery state that we're looking for, a higher level recovery state. And it will inform the structure of the model that will link these components together. So then we specifically explore the dependence of employee return to work on housing recovery. So we ask the business owners and managers if their business experienced issues with employees not returning to work because of housing specifically. So here we're seeking to establish that delay in housing recovery has an impact on businesses, and to what extent is that impact. Again, we're looking at the connection and the access between these services. So here we look at education sector and residential sector, as well as a broader set of community services. And we want to know a series of things that may delay a household in returning. So now we're getting beyond just the employment, and we're thinking about access. What are the access to services? What about the child's school, place of school enrollment, and a closure or a change of that school? And then the educational recovery of the children. So we ask this of households in order to make linkages between the qualitative data that we're collecting from our school representatives and try to understand how the timing of these pieces and the decisions that are being made at the school level are having an impact on the housing recovery, and the opposite way, on the decisions made by households having an impact on school recovery. And finally, we look at the dependence of the physical recovery of these housing units and business establishments on the restoration of the supporting infrastructure that they need. And we wanted to know in both cases about disruption, so the length of disruption, the severity, and which particular infrastructure elements were disrupted for each housing and business. And this helps us to establish a better overall recovery timeline. So what we found in many cases is that the coming back on of particular infrastructure services had everything to do with when the business returned to operational status. So while electricity may have come back very early, the lack of water delayed businesses quite a bit. And for many of them, they were entirely dependent on their physical location to operate. So now I'm going to pass it back to Elena to talk about our second study objective, documenting recovery.
Thanks, Maria. So let's take a look at some preliminary findings. Damage is a primary factor for predicting the timeline for recovery. We recorded damage for households and for businesses, and this enables us to spatially map damage distribution as a function of location and inundation level, as you see here for housing. We also asked about repair progress through time to eventually map out the physical and temporal aspects of recovery. To measure progress towards recovery, we used indicators. For housing, we used indicators of reconstruction of the housing unit, reoccupancy, restored stability, and restored accessibility. So we defined stability as that household being able to and planning to stay in that residential unit for at least 1 year. So they're no longer in this temporary state of moving around after the disaster. And we defined accessibility as that household being able to have the same access to essential needs such as grocery stores, healthcare, and employment, the same level as, say, the level now is being the same as what they had before the disaster. We developed 4 housing recovery states that were built off of these indicators, and if we take a preliminary look at the distribution across these recovery states, we see that 2% of our housing samples had been repaired but not yet reoccupied or anything else. 53% had been reoccupied but not yet repaired or anything else. 1% had been repaired, reoccupied, and indicated restored stability, and 9% indicated all 4, so that additionally accessibility. If you're wondering why these don't sum to 1, I'll show you that, or 100%, I'll show you that in a few slides, but first let's look at business indicators. So for businesses, we looked at restored operating capacity, restored revenue, restored number of employees, and as I was talking about through that building imagery, the perceived status in recovery noted by the building owner or the manager who we were talking to. So this was a multiple choice question with 5 different answers, and if we take a look at this distribution across our business samples, we see that 44% of the owners or managers indicated that they were fully recovered. So that was really amazing to see. However, 6% indicated that they were still in survival mode, and 3% indicated that they would never recover from the impacts of the flooding, including one of the samples that I showed you earlier. For schools, we collected information through the housing survey as well as through the qualitative interviews that Maria mentioned earlier with different school representatives. We used repair and restoration of the school buildings, recovery decisions made by the school district, student return, employee return, and the parents' perceived educational recovery of their child or of their children as indicators for school recovery. This last one, again, was a multiple choice question, and the parents were able to say whether their child's education was better than it was before the flood, back to where it was before the flood, uncertain because things are still changing, or worse than before the flood. And if we plot this distribution across our samples, we see that 59% said back to where it was before the flood, and 11% had even had improvements. So that was really wonderful. But 19% said uncertain because things are still changing, and 11% said that it was worse off than before the flood. And so these are kind of high percentages to have, indicating negative responses or declining recovery trajectories, and there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. There have been major losses in the students in the school district. In fact, one high school has lost 10% of their students. One elementary school shut down immediately after the flooding, as all of them did, but never opened back up because of the damage was too severe. Another elementary school is facing right now a closure decision due to low enrollment. Repair and reconstruction progress has been slow for some school buildings, and the timing and the receipt of incoming financial recovery resources is a major contributor to that. And in the meantime, many of these schools are operating out of other alternate locations, which has had negative impacts on some of the students. So we've talked about recovery trajectories. Now I want to take a look at some. So we know that not all households, not all housing units, and not all businesses or schools are the same before the disaster, but in fact there is pre-event vulnerability that very much influences how that impact occurs and how that recovery is going to take place. And so we measured, we used a series of indicators to measure pre-event vulnerability for the housing samples by capturing the education level, the race and ethnicity, and the income level of the households occupying the housing unit, as well as tenure status, whether they were renters or owners, and housing type, single family, multifamily, mobile home, for example. We did this for businesses as well, and we used business sector tenure status for the business, whether they rented or owned the building, age of the business, as well as the business ownership structure to indicate what the pre-event vulnerability for the businesses were. We talked about damage already, so we captured damage. So moving into that drop of the recovery curve, when we went in for wave 1, we did detailed engineering evaluations, engineering damage evaluations of the housing units, where the intention was to look at the building exterior, the building interior, and the contents. But many times, even oftentimes, we weren't able to see or go inside to get that next level to do our damage evaluation. So when we returned in wave 2, we were able to talk to those residents and learn about what repairs they had to do and reevaluate or confirm the damage state that we had classified that building as back in wave 1. Additionally, as I mentioned, in Wave 2, we classified damage for businesses, and we looked at the building exterior as well as the interior, the contents and the merchandise, as well as equipment and machinery, and established an analogous for damage state classification system. So, we measured variability with initial damage, and we measured indicators for differences in pre-event vulnerability, and we largely see variation across our housing and business samples. We'd like to see upward trajectories, but instead we have observed significant variability in recovery progress across samples, where 1 year later, 35% of sampled housing units haven't reached any stage of recovery. This figure is marked for housing, but we observe similar trends for businesses and schools. Variability in recovery progress is a function of a number of factors, including the ones I'm showing here, pre-event vulnerability and damage level, as well as decision-making, incoming financial resources, the availability of recovery resources, and other logistical challenges and delays. And we were able to capture and collect data on all of these factors for businesses, housing, and for schools. So in conclusion, as a result of the Wave 2 data collection, we are able to investigate differences between housing damage states in Wave 1 and Wave 2 to improve field study methodology, as well as test out new technologies and use new equipment in the field. We're able to support the ongoing development of recovery models for housing, businesses, and for schools, as well as inform the structure of an integrated community recovery model using those interdependency-based questions. As you can see in our data, and as we learned, many households, housing units, businesses, and other community sectors are in the early stages of recovery. Some types of federal assistance had not arrived to Lumberton to be distributed to households, among other places, or arrived to many of the schools in Lumberton as of January of this year. We are planning to return for a Wave 3 trip and hoping to do a Wave 4 trip as well. And so we will be reaching out to members within the COE team for your help. The Wave 1 report is to be released soon, so please check the COE website, resilience.coloradostate.edu, later this summer for it. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you to the so many people who contributed to the development of this work and these slides. And now I will pass it back over to co-director Bruce Ellingwood to give us closing remarks on what is to come next year.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you to all of the center investigators who made interesting presentations this morning. I think that you will agree that the center's research programs, all of them, you can see, are broadly interdisciplinary in nature, and I think that's one of the things that characterizes this effort and makes it absolutely distinct in that it's been able to advance the paradigm of interdisciplinary research in community resilience science. I'd like to just say a few remarks about year 4. The year 4 theme will be risk-informed decision support. That doesn't mean that all of the work on recovery stops. A lot of it continues on from year to year. But we are shifting our interest this year toward risk-informed decision support, and particularly the development of risk-informed decision framework, which can be incorporated into the in-core computational environment. We would like to have in core, we would like to have a set of so-called default models that investigators might use or scientists might use for examining community research. We also would like to provide a framework to incorporate user-defined models so that if a researcher has a specific type of a problem that they're interested in working with, they will be able to swap models in and out of the system in an open source sort of a framework. We would like to demonstrate the ability of in-core to operate with accuracy at the intersection between physical systems, science and social policy, and urban planning. And we would like to demonstrate the information and process flow that supports community resilience assessment from the hindcasts and from the testbed program and the longitudinal studies that are continuing. Please mark your calendars for May 1st, 2019 for the next webinar, which in fact will focus on what we hope to achieve in the coming year on risk-informed decision support. And on behalf of the nearly 100 investigators that are involved in the Center Research Program, we appreciate your interest in the Center's research program and are grateful that you wanted to spend the morning with us in participating in this webinar. So we will now take questions. If you haven't sent in your question yet, there is still time to do so at the site shown here on the slide. So we'll begin the question and answering. If the speakers who spoke, please come over, or you can get to the microphone quickly in order to answer questions if I call upon you.
Okay, well, thank you, Bruce. We've had a few questions come in. I'll go ahead and read them. And again, those of you out there connected via internet, please email your questions to the resilience@colostate.edu. We have about 20 minutes. So the first question is, how or why did you select MMSA? Are you working with local officials there?
Okay, the question for those, why did we select MMSA as a test bed? There are several reasons for it. The first reason was that we had done some preliminary work on the topology of the Shelby County area during the research that was conducted as part of the May Center research in the early 2000s. And so at least some of the building structures and some of the utilities and systems and the road systems were already available through Mayviz. That was one reason for it. The second reason for it was that at the suggestion or the urging, I might say, of our external advisory panel, to which we've been responsive, we were urged to take on a large urban area as resilience assessment. As a researcher, I believe you have to crawl before you walk and run. And so we started with relatively simple community structures at the beginning. But Memphis and the 9-county area surrounding Memphis is a major metropolitan area, and it consists of about 1.5 million people, actually. The city of Memphis is about 700,000, and Shelby County is about 950,000, and the MMSA is about 1,500,000. So that's a very real community, and it despite the fact that we have 100 investigators in the center, it sort of stretches our capability in being able to analyze something that large in terms of fundamental research. And the other reason for selecting it was that we were interested in looking at, ultimately in resilience assessment, how the resilience of a particular community might depend upon the resources available in the surrounding counties to that community. And the MMSA has, Shelby County has a common governance structure, and there are cooperative agreements between the different counties. So one might expect, if there were a repeat of the 1811, 1812 earthquake sequence, that the entire MMSA area would work together and try to address the problems that arise there. So it enables us to look at issues associated with the interfaces between governmental structures, at scaling and resolution of community resilient systems, and it enables us to do it with a community that is reasonable to handle, as opposed to trying to analyze Los Angeles, for example, or New York City, which was suggested early in the life of the center, and we decided that we would waste a lot of time looking at communities of that size. But MMSA provides a real test of the in-core environment. As to working with local officials, some of our team members have in fact visited Memphis Water, Gas, Light, to get information on the on the structural topology of the utility systems within the Memphis area. So we have reached out to people in the Memphis area in an attempt to engage them in that.
Okay, thank you. And the next question may involve multiple answers. So what has been done to model building back to beyond the initial quality of infrastructure? For example, when Greensburg, Kansas was 95% destroyed by a tornado, the decision to build back as a green community exceeded the socioeconomic capacity of many residents to rebuild in that community, leading to selective gentrification. Are there models to inform policy that would demonstrate the need to subsidize these families to allow them to stay in their communities while increasing resilience for future disasters of different types?
Paula, do you want to try that? Or, well, you're right, it's a multiple. Okay. Oh.
I know Walt's.
All right, Walt.
Yeah, currently the answer is no. That is not there. I think that is certainly something that we are considering in terms of our the next year's work and what would be entailed to bring things up to a higher building code standard and the like. We certainly can see. I mean, the point that was made there, I think, is right on. We can see that once that 50% threshold is reached, then we see, major drop-offs in terms of recovery for housing, especially again in low-income areas and rental housing in those areas. So it exacerbates those issues, and that is an ongoing issue that I think we're all struggling with in terms of that is at the policy level as well as in the resource level to do that. Some insurance policies have riders to bring things up to building code, but being able to afford those riders, as well as the issues in terms of flood and other related areas that would not be covered by typical insurance, are highly problematic.
I'll just add a little bit more. So Professor Sarah Hamadeh at Iowa State University and I, in our kind of qualitative flow diagram for the housing system, identified a number of different hazard-specific, community-specific policies that we'd observed in the literature. And so we have been thinking through ways of incorporating those as basically options that could be explored in the NCORE environment. The modeling, the quantitative modeling work on that, as Walt was saying, hasn't gotten to very far levels yet, though. But it's very much on our radar.
The other thing I think we can add is from our qualitative interviews within the community of Lumberton, we do find that there are important co-benefits that are arising as a result of some of the repair and reconstruction of existing buildings. So for example, in Lumberton, a large number of the public buildings were damaged by the flooding, and these needed to have significant repairs. As a result, the community is now seeing how these buildings have been able to be modernized, have upgraded technology, and that there are these benefits. So it's certainly true that we understand that there are these opportunities for increasing and expanding the resilience of these buildings, but how to build that into our modeling is a different question, and one that I think we will continue to explore.
Yes, we have started to consider this issue. So we know from an economic perspective what has to happen for the economy to grow faster or to a higher steady state than before. So, and most has to do with changes in total factor productivity. So we're actually thinking about how we can reconfigure a city so its equilibrium level of output would be higher than before. But the question's great. I think that's something we're spending a lot of time thinking about, and hopefully we'll make some progress in the near future.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, we don't have any more questions from online, but please send those if you are online. And so I'll open it up to questions for colleagues here. We have about 100 people present here. Do I have any questions? Alberto?
Hi, I have actually two questions for Professor Nathaniel. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was extremely interesting, and I think that the reoccupancy model would be extremely useful for testing the resiliency of communities. And the first question is, would it be possible to consider the temporary housing or temporary schools in preventing the people to outmigrate while maybe the original school, the original building they live in is not functional yet? And the second question is, do you think that alongside with schools and firms, maybe also nursing homes would be interesting to consider, maybe because people have older parents to take care of, and if this nursing home are destroyed, they have to maybe relocate to take care of them in another site? Thank you.
Thank you. So your question is about so are we considering temporary housing, temporary schools, and how that might influence people's decisions to stay in a community?
Yeah, it might prevent them to stay to move even if the original building is not yet functional, because the occupancy means when the building is functional, they will move back to the original city they live in. But maybe if they have a temporary place to stay or temporary place to send their kids to school, they maybe will decide to stay even in the long period.
Well, I think one of the benefits of the Lumberton survey is we do have some potential data that will influence our model for other areas. And what we're trying to do currently is to establish the need for temporary housing, the need for temporary schools. And at this point, I wouldn't say we haven't necessarily included that next step, but at least at this point we can identify areas of a community that have extended periods where housing will be an issue, extended periods where school closures will be an issue, and then from that information, hopefully we'll be able to inform potential decisions or policies that'll say if we have a temporary shelter, temporary school, where would that need to be located, and how many people would that benefit, and then how those people might be impacted. So I'd say it's something we're definitely trying to get to, but at this point our step one is to identify how many people and how many schools and where those are located, and the amount of time that issue, the lack of functionality, is an issue. That was question one, or did
Yes.
Hopefully?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question from Dr. Cruz.
Yes, this is probably for Elena and Maria, and also for Walt, and it has to do with the recovery in the regions. Were you able to document sort of the financial flows, which are going to inform the CGE modeling, in the form of insurance payments and mitigation block grants, and sort of when people got that and that timing, and how that might affect the recovery?
Thanks, Jamie, for that question. I'll get us started, and probably Walt and Maria will both want to chime in. Through our research, and experiences, we identified the inflow of recovery resources as probably the primary factor in recovery trajectories. And we have fought to receive this data at the household level from a number of different entities. And you heard from Walt and from Shannon a little bit earlier about how they've been able to obtain finally some data for Galveston on that. But absolutely, we looked at this. This was the major driver for the Wave 2 Lumberton study, actually, that I didn't highlight as much in the presentation. We asked households, did they apply for, when they applied for, did they receive, when they received FEMA IHP funds, SBA loans, insurance money, homeowners, flood insurance, renters insurance. We asked them about charitable donations. We asked about donations from friends and family. We asked them about HUD CDBG funds coming in. So we did ask them for a range of different recovery resources, when they applied, if and when they received, and yeah, when they received. So absolutely.
The elephant in the room, right? I mean, that is the question. That is, and so we're struggling with that. We will have data on the few households that are in their residence when we are able to interview them, but that is a very selective sample. It's a biased component of our sample as well, too, because we don't know what's going on with renters. We don't know what's going on with, so that is a major problem. Maria Watson, one of our graduate students, has been able to kind of tap in and been able to get NFIP data for businesses, SBA data for businesses, as well as for housing. So that's the one area that we've been able to get those data. We're in constant, well, I mean, we're in continual contacts and attempts to try to get those data, and it's going to be nigh on impossible. I hope that at least from the federal sources that we should be able to get those. I mean, we have IRB protections. There's no reason that we shouldn't be able to utilize those data. From the private sector, you know, I mean, that's going to be highly problematic. Again, we're going to have to depend exclusively upon the data that we can get from our households and make some general statements along those lines. And so, you know, that's one of the reasons we also are employing these, in some sense, surrogate measures. They're not quite surrogate measures because they also have independent effects, but race, ethnicity, income, because those factors are major drivers of getting access to those other resources. And so we're employing those to try to capture indirectly some of those things. Very frustrating, but thank you for your question.
So we do have 3 other questions that have come in online, so I thought I'd like to go ahead and take those first. So one question was, do you have any plans to investigate the impact of Maria on Puerto Rico? For instance, differences between North Carolina and Puerto Rico as an island. And then the second part to the question is, from the work that you have done, what lessons can be gleaned to explain what is happening in Puerto Rico?
Those are both great questions. And so I'll answer the first part of the question, which is that we're happy to announce, and we have announced, that NIST has established a national construction safety team to investigate the impacts of Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico. The focus there is to characterize the wind hazard and the technical reasons for why there were fatalities in Puerto Rico. The second is to look at building performance of sample critical structures in Puerto Rico. And the third is to look at communication failures and issues with the emergency response as it is related to evacuations in Puerto Rico. That all falls under one statutory program, which is the NCST statutory program. We have other statutory authorities at NIST, and we plan to take advantage of those. One of those includes the National Wind Impact Reduction Program. And so we're also exploring looking at other recovery-related issues, so that might answer the second half of the question. So in terms of recovery and resilience, Puerto Rico is unfortunately an ideal location to study. And so we'll be leveraging all the efforts of the center and incorporating that into hopefully some additional research studies under our other authorities. So I hope that answers both questions.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
The next question, Bruce, I believe this one would be for you, is at what point will full engagement occur with the International Code Council and American Planning Association? So maybe for Walt also, this would be, or Shannon as well, this would be the logical path to implementation at the community level.
I'll answer the first part of the question, and I think I'll let Walt.
Well, I'm going to let Shannon do it.
Let Shannon do the second part of it. Developing recommendations or guidelines for best practices for resilience-based design is part of our brief. We are not to the point yet where we're prepared to do that. There are a number of very practical issues that will have to be dealt with, some of which lie outside the center. For example, our research has clearly indicated, and as you've seen from this webinar and the other webinars that we've had before, that the resilience of communities depends very much on interconnected physical, social, and economic systems. And that scale or that scope is much broader than the scope of the International Building Code or the International Code Council. And so there will have to be some significant spade work done in order to shift the paradigm in civil engineering facilities design from the focus on individual infrastructure components and systems to systems of systems. And we're not at the point where we're prepared to do that yet, but I think this is something that we will be interested in providing. If sometime in the next few years, at least, to start on this sort of an activity. Bear in mind that neither NIST nor the center have any building code or regulatory authority. All we can do is suggest what best practices might be. As to what people do with those, that's something that's outside the scope of our center's activities. But we are aware of the fact that this is an issue. There are some activities ongoing within ASCE that are focused on resilience-based design. Those activities, to date, have focused primarily on how to design individual buildings and other types of structures for rapid recovery after a post-disaster, and they do not consider how the function of the structure integrates within the necessary function for health and welfare in the community. So there's quite a gap there, and it's going to require some time to address that.
Shannon?
Just a note about the American Planning Association as another body for pursuing the increase of kinds of standards. Definitely, we're engaged with APA. I met with them last week at their annual conference. They have a hazards research center, and they also have a division called Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery, which includes planning professionals that are engaged across the country in trying to understand the ways in which we can increase resilience through our planning regulatory approaches, as well as encouraging building standard increases and kind of performance standard based, where we want all new construction to be built at a certain kind of level. I think it is important to remember that APA also has no regulatory authority, and states and local communities also vary greatly in their ability or willingness and capacity to implement these kinds of regulations. Certainly in Texas, and as a low capacity state, very low reg state, we don't even have building codes at the county level, for example, which I know a lot of people find amazing, but I repeat, yes, that's true. And so it's very important to consider the variation across states and local communities in terms of the whatever standards are out there and their kind of ability and willingness to implement them.
Okay, well, thank you. You may want to remain at the podium for the next question. So this is actually a perfect segue into a regulatory question. Land use issues and permitting issues were not well covered. These are regulatory constraints that play a part in the timing of reconstruction for buildings and where they are allowed. Has any research team addressed these issues?
Well, it's a good question, and it's not a study that's necessarily part of our NIST project, but Walt and I have a database of about 3,000 communities from along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. Did a survey a couple of years ago looking at the land use practices, not only that are on the books, but the extent to which they are actually employed in these communities. We've done some preliminary analysis of those data, and of course we do see that there are a lot of tools that are woefully underutilized in terms of land use planning related to resilience, and then others that are more used, and certainly building codes and zoning are among the most commonly used, while other types of conservation approaches and other land use approaches that would limit or restrict construction in certain areas are less well utilized. And of course, again, there's a lot of variation by state. One of the things that we're interested in pursuing is what those differences among states are and how that relates to the political context in each of those states. You want to add anything to that?
Okay, thank you. So we don't have any more questions online, but I believe we have one here in the audience.
Yes, this fantastic research is really fascinating, and it's revealed, at least for me, the degree of complexity and nuance in all of the interdependencies that we have to deal with here. And my question is, as you begin to assemble all of this great work into INCORE, do you find yourself reaching sort of practical limitations on how much of this interdependency you can model and what needs to be broken? And are you facing that? And if so, what does that look like?
I'll take a crack at that and let others on the team chime in. We are engaged this year in a discussion prompted by a request from some of our NIST collaborators to consider what INCORE is going to look like, at least partway through the fifth year. And that's going to, that process is ongoing, Glenn, and it has to do with what can we possibly accomplish in the remaining, 22 months approximately of the center. And as a result of that critical self-examination, we've decided that there are certain things that originally we thought we would be able to do, and we're not going to be able to do those. They will have to wait for another time. Hopefully, there will be another time, but they won't be done within the last in the last 2 years of the center. And so, what we're aiming for is an in-course structure which is relatively modularized, which will enable researchers, but not generally professional practitioners, to, first of all, look at the test beds and the hindcasts that we've done and independently verify and analyze them and change parameters in them to see what the effect of various parameters might be, and perhaps to build some of their own simple test communities using those modules that would enable them to look at different scenario events. We are not, I don't think, in the next year and a half going to have fully coupled risk analysis. I think that we will have a method for selecting scenarios so that some idea as to the relative performance of a community to various levels of intensity might have, but I think the analysis is going to continue to be based on scenarios as we've done it before, because it's the only way that we can properly capture the spatial correlation in the distribution of natural hazards with large geographic footprints. I think that the analysis will be done using what we have called, and what John, I think, referred to in his presentation, as a Tier 1 analysis, where we utilize relatively simple models of those spatial distributions, but allow for the fact that if somebody wants to look at seismic response of Memphis, taking into account three-dimensional wave propagation in the Mississippi embayment, that we will be able to provide that resource for them to do that. But that's not going to be part of the functioning model of INCORE, because if we take the time to do that, we're not going to be able to take the time to input some of the recovery models that Walt and Shannon and the social team are working on right now, nor will we be able to develop the social accounting matrices that are necessary to run the generalized equilibrium economic models that Harvey and his team are working on. So, this is a time for making decisions, and we are in the process of making those decisions, and probably within the next couple of months that will clarify. But right now, we're trying to finish up as best we can the tasks that we've embarked upon, so that we have a convincing story to tell.
Okay, we have one more comment from Paulo Gardoni. Paulo?
Yeah. Just to add, today I just want to point out that we have been working with the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, NCSA, at the University of Illinois. Was understated probably in today's presentation, but much of what you have seen today is really the science behind the modeling, but we have been working closely with professional programmers to bring together INCORE. And so the end product, the compromises Bruce was talking about, really will come from the selection of the models that we think are important, and really working with them for the practical implementation so that we have an end product that can be successful.
Okay, we've got one more question, Harvey. This will be for you. What is the and then we'll be ending the webinar, Bruce. What is the significance of the SD-CGE model related to other techniques?
The advantage of a CG model is it's very data intensive. So we collect an enormous amount of data for behavior of households and firms. So that's why it lends nicely to a project like this. But it's highly parameterized. So it has a lot of different elasticity values, and it's important to examine a range of elasticity values that could give you a range of results that could influence policy. So, but then talking to some of the engineers yesterday, which will go unnamed, you also make decisions about different parameter values that can influence outcomes. So we're looking at we're trying to use theoretical models to come up with, applied results that can be useful to policymakers. So I think at the end of the day, we have to look at the wide range of outcomes that are influenced by important parameter values or elasticity values. using a simpler model, a theoretical model, which is much more contained, you just can't get the richness of results that you need to come up with useful policy recommendations. So this is an important question. So
Thanks, Harvey.
Well, thank you once again for joining us this morning for our third annual webinar on the center activities. I want to remind you again, to join us next year on the 1st of May to find out what we've accomplished in the area of risk-informed decision-making and its implementation into INCORE. And with that, I would like to thank you all for attending and close the seminar. Thank you very much.